opened up. They have to open up the Strait of Hormuz. Excuse me, I'm so sorry.
As of today, there is
Such a
growing
terrible
evidence
mistake.
that the
Fake
United
news will
States
say, "He
is preparing for
accidentally
a
said
possible
no."
deployment of
There's
ground
no
troops
accidents
in
with me,
Iran.
not too many.
This is not speculation. Multiple signals in policy, military readiness, and public statements point in this direction. The immediate consequence is clear. If U.S. troops enter Iran, the risk of direct military conflict with Iranian forces increases dramatically, and it could draw in regional powers as well. For individuals and businesses, this translates into higher oil prices, market volatility, and a geopolitical shock that could affect jobs, energy bills, and global supply chains. Let's examine the first set of indicators. Statements from the Secretary of Defense over the past months have emphasized that all options are on the table, including explicit boots-on-the-ground language. Logistics reports indicate increased movement of armored units and rapid deployment forces toward bases in Iraq, signaling operational preparation. The second factor is congressional awareness. Certain senators, including members of the Gang of Eight, have been briefed repeatedly, with several expressing concern over the open-ended nature of any military engagement. They do not yet know the full cost, the exit strategy, or the political ramifications, yet deployment seems increasingly likely. This situation is unusual. Historically, U.S. engagements in the Middle East have relied heavily on air power and proxy forces. Iran represents a far more entrenched and territorially capable opponent. Ground deployment is not a minor escalation. It is a strategic decision that could take months to execute and exposes U.S. personnel to significant operational risk. Iran has publicly stated its readiness to confront any invasion. Their military exercises and missile deployments over the last 2 years suggest deliberate preparation for foreign troops on their soil. Russian support for Iran, particularly in intelligence and weapons systems, further complicates the operational environment. This is not theoretical. It is a high-stakes, multi-actor conflict scenario. Economically, any ground operation could immediately spike oil prices. Iran controls roughly 4% of global oil supply, and any disruption in the Persian Gulf would ripple through gas prices worldwide. Politically, U.S. domestic pressure will increase. Conventional forces alone cannot sustain a prolonged engagement, making broader mobilization possible. Socially, public opinion is likely to fracture along partisan and generational lines.
Historical precedent is important. Consider Iraq in 2003. The decision to deploy ground troops without a fully defined exit strategy led to over a decade of entanglement, insurgency, and high casualties. Iran's terrain and strategic depth make it an even more challenging environment. We are looking at a situation that could mirror or exceed Iraq in scale and complexity. The combination of U.S. ground deployment, Iranian military readiness, and Russian involvement creates a scenario in which conflict could escalate quickly, possibly before diplomatic solutions are fully explored. The risk of miscalculation is extremely high. For viewers, this has direct consequences. Energy prices could rise sharply within weeks. Supply chains could tighten, affecting electronics, food, and fuel. Defense spending will increase, and sectors such as airlines and commodities will experience volatility. For Americans living in strategic regions, the likelihood of receiving news about U.S. casualties or military mobilization increases. The chain reaction is logical and predictable. Deployment of U.S. troops leads to potential Iranian attacks on U.S. forces, followed by retaliatory strikes in the Gulf, disruption of maritime trade routes, a global energy price shock, financial market volatility, and domestic political crisis. Each step is supported by observed behavior and historical patterns. Next, predictive scenarios emerge. Best case, limited deployment acts as leverage. Diplomacy prevails. Casualties remain low and markets stabilize within 3 to 6 months. Worst case, prolonged engagement, high casualties, full military engagement between Iran and the US, potential overt Russian support, energy crisis escalation, and global market contraction. Consider concrete numbers. A 5% disruption in Persian Gulf oil exports could raise global oil prices by $15 to $20 per barrel, translating into immediate increases in gasoline and heating costs. For families, this is tangible. For investors, market exposure is significant. Key insight: the decision to deploy ground troops is not just military, it is a political, economic, and social multiplier. Understanding both the signals and historical patterns is crucial for predicting outcomes. Every statement from the Pentagon, every military exercise in Iran, and every missile test is a data point. When connected, the trajectory becomes clear. The next few months could determine whether escalation occurs or diplomatic measures succeed. The bottom line: the deployment of U.S. ground troops in Iran would mark a historic escalation with cascading effects on energy, finance, politics, and security. This is not theory, it is predictive analysis based on concrete data. The critical question is not if this could happen, but how prepared individuals, businesses, and policymakers are to respond if it does. Every signal matters, and understanding the patterns now is the difference between being reactive and being ready.
So, if the objective is regime change or total neutralization of military capability, airstrikes are insufficient, and that creates pressure. Pressure inside the Pentagon, pressure inside the administration, pressure from allies who are directly exposed to Iranian retaliation. And eventually, that pressure converges on one conclusion: ground forces. But here's where it becomes dangerous. Because deploying ground troops into Iran is not like entering Iraq in 2003. This is a country that has spent decades preparing specifically for that scenario: urban warfare, mountainous terrain, decentralized militias, regional proxy networks. This is not a short-term operation. Which means the moment ground troops are deployed, the timeline of the conflict expands dramatically. And once that happens, you run into the second constraint: manpower. Modern Western militaries are not structured for prolonged, large-scale occupation without significant strain. Recruitment numbers are already under pressure, public support for war is fragile, and casualty sensitivity is extremely high. So how do you sustain a long war? You don't, unless you increase manpower. And that leads directly to the most controversial element of the prediction: a national draft. Now, this is where many people instinctively reject the idea. It feels politically impossible, socially explosive. But that's precisely the point. Because in this model, the draft is not just a military necessity, it's a catalyst for internal destabilization. Think about the social environment right now. Polarization is already high, trust in institutions is low, economic pressure is increasing, housing costs, inflation, job insecurity. Now introduce a draft into that system. You're not just asking people to support a war, you're asking them to personally participate in it. And that changes everything. Protests escalate, political divisions harden, state-level resistance becomes possible. The National Guard is deployed not externally, but internally. And at that point, the conflict is no longer just overseas, it becomes domestic. This is why the prediction of civil unrest or even civil conflict is tied directly to the deployment of ground troops. It's not a separate event, it's a consequence. Now, layer on the international dimension. Because while the US is dealing with internal strain, external actors are not standing still. Russia's involvement, whether direct or indirect, introduces a new level of risk. Not necessarily full-scale confrontation, but strategic support, intelligence, logistics, advanced weaponry. China, while less directly involved militarily, has economic leverage, energy markets, supply chains, financial systems. And then there's the regional response. If Iran is engaged in a full-scale war with the United States, neighboring countries cannot remain neutral indefinitely. Some will be drawn in directly, others indirectly through alliances and economic dependencies. Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Gulf states, each has its own strategic interests, each has its own vulnerabilities. And as they enter the conflict, whether by choice or necessity, the war expands. This is the escalation phase. Multiple fronts, multiple actors, increasing unpredictability. And here's the key point. At this stage, control becomes extremely difficult. Because the more actors involved, the less centralized the decision-making becomes. Miscalculations increase, accidental escalations become more likely. A single event, a misfired missile, a misinterpreted signal, can trigger a chain reaction. Now, let's return to the third prediction, the destruction of a major religious site. Within this analytical framework, this is not viewed as a random event. It is seen as a trigger point, something that shifts the conflict from geopolitical to civilizational. Because once a site of that significance is destroyed, regardless of how or why, the reaction is immediate and widespread. It mobilizes populations, not just governments. It reframes the conflict in existential terms. And that's when wars become far more difficult to contain. Now, whether this specific prediction is correct or not is less important than understanding its role in the model.
It represents a point of no return, a moment where de-escalation becomes almost impossible. So when you put all of this together, what you get is not a single prediction, but a sequence. Ground troops, extended war, manpower strain, draft, domestic unrest, multi-state escalation, potential trigger event, systemic destabilization. Each step leads to the next, and that's the core idea here, causality. Not isolated events, but interconnected processes. Now, let's bring this back to the individual level, because it's easy to get lost in the scale of this analysis. But what does this actually mean for the average person? First, economic impact. Wars of this scale are expensive. They increase government spending, often leading to higher debt and inflation. Energy prices become volatile. Supply chains are disrupted. Second, social impact. Increased polarization, potential restrictions, greater uncertainty about the future. Third, geopolitical shifts. Alliances change, power balances shift, new players emerge while others decline. And finally, personal risk. Whether through economic instability, policy changes, or in extreme scenarios, direct involvement. So the real takeaway here is not whether every detail of this prediction unfolds exactly as described, it's understanding the trajectory. Understanding how certain decisions, once made, limit future options, and recognizing that complex systems don't collapse all at once, they escalate, step by step, until one day, what once seemed unthinkable becomes inevitable. And the only real question left is, at what point does the system cross that line?